He did not know that he had leaped to his feet, that he stood staring down at James Taggart, seeing in the unbridled shapelessness of Taggart's features the answer to all the devastation he had witnessed through the years of his life. "What's the matter, Mr. Reardon? What have I said?" Taggart was asking with rising anxiety, but he was out of reach of Taggart's voice. He was seeing the progression of the years, the monstrous extortions, the impossible demands, the inexplicable victories of evil, the preposterous plans and unintelligible goals proclaimed in volumes of muddy philosophy, the desperate wonder of the victims who thought that some complex malevolent wisdom was moving the powers, destroying the world. And all of it had rested on one tenet, behind the shifty eyes of the victors. He'll do something. We'll get away with it. He'll let us. He'll do something. You businessmen kept predicting that we'd perish, but we haven't. It was true, he thought. They had not been blind to reality. He had, blind to the reality he himself had created. No, they had not perished. But who had? Who had perished, to pay for their manner of survival? Ellis Wyatt, Ken Danager, Francisco d'Anconia. He was reaching for his hat and coat when he noticed that the men in the room were trying to stop him, that their faces had a look of panic and their voices were crying in bewilderment. "What's the matter, Mr. Reardon? Why? But why? What have we said? You're not going. You can't go. It's too early. Not yet. Oh, not yet." He felt as if he were seeing them from the rear window of a speeding express, as if they stood on the track behind him, waving their arms in futile gestures and screaming indistinguishable sounds, their figures growing smaller in the distance, their voices fading. One of them tried to stop him as he turned to the door. He pushed him out of his way, not roughly, but with a simple, smooth sweep of his arm, as one brushes aside an obstructing curtain, then walked out. Silence was his only sensation as he sat at the wheel of his car, speeding back down the road to Philadelphia. It was the silence of immobility within him, as if possessing knowledge he could now afford to rest, with no further activity of soul. He felt nothing, neither anguish nor elation. It was as if, by an effort of years, he had climbed a mountain to gain a distant view, and having reached the top, had fallen to lie still, to rest before he looked, free to spare himself for the first time. He was aware of the long, empty road streaming, then curving, then streaming straight before him, of the effortless pressure of his hands on the wheel, and the screech of the tires on the curves. But he felt as if he were speeding down a skyway suspended and coiling in empty space. The passers-by at the factories, the bridges, the power plants along his road saw a sight that had once been natural among them, a trim, expensively powerful car driven by a confident man, with the concept of success proclaimed more loudly than by any electric sign, proclaimed by the driver's garments, by his expert steering, by his purposeful speed. They watched him go past and vanish into the haze, equating earth with night. He saw his mills rising in the darkness as a black silhouette against a breathing glow. The glow was the color of burning gold, and Reardon Steel stood written across the sky in the cool white fire of crystal. He looked at the long silhouette, the curves of blast furnaces standing like triumphal arches, the smokestacks rising like a solemn colonnade along an avenue of honor in an imperial city, the bridges hanging like garlands, the cranes saluting like lances, the smoke waving slowly like flags. The sight broke the stillness within him, and he smiled in greeting. It was a smile of happiness, of love, of dedication. He had never loved his mills as he did in that moment, for, seeing them by an act of his own vision, cleared of all but his own code of values, in a luminous reality that held no contradictions, he was seeing the reason of his love. The mills were an achievement of his mind, devoted to his enjoyment of existence, erected in a rational world to deal with rational men. If those men had vanished, if that world was gone, if his mills had ceased to serve his values, then the mills were only a pile of dead scrap, to be left to crumble, the sooner the better. To be left, not as an act of treason, but as an act of loyalty to their actual meaning. The mills were still a mile ahead when a small spurt of flame caught his sudden attention. Among all the shades of fire in the vast spread of structures, he could tell the abnormal and the out of place. This one was too raw a shade of yellow, and it was darting from a spot where no fire had reason to be, from a structure by the gate of the main entrance. In the next instant, he heard the dry crack of a gunshot, then 3 answering cracks in swift succession like an angry hand slapping a sudden assailant. Then the black mass, barring the road in the distance, took shape. It was not mere darkness, and it did not recede as he came closer. It was a mob squirming at the main gate trying to storm the mills. He had time to distinguish waving arms, some with clubs, some with crowbars, some with rifles, the yellow flames of burning wood gushing from the window of the gatekeeper's office, the blue cracks of gunfire darting out of the mob, and the answers spitting from the roofs of the structures. He had time to see a human figure twisting backward and falling from the top of a car. Then he sent his wheels into a shrieking curve, turning into the darkness of a side road. He was going at the rate of 60 miles an hour down the ruts of an unpaved soil, toward the eastern gate of the mills, and the gate was in sight when the impact of tires on a gully threw the car off the road to the edge of a ravine where an ancient slag heap lay at the bottom. With the weight of his chest and elbow on the wheel, pitted against 2 tons of speeding metal, the curve of his body forced the curve of the car to complete its screaming half-circle, sweeping it back onto the road and into the control of his hands. It had taken 1 instant, but in the next his foot went down on the brake, tearing the engine to a stop. For in the moment when his headlights had swept the ravine, he had glimpsed an oblong shape, darker than the gray of the weeds on the slope, and it had seemed to him that a brief white blur had been a human hand waving for help. Throwing off his overcoat, he went hurrying down the side of the ravine, lumps of earth giving way under his feet. He went catching at the dried coils of brush, half running, half sliding toward the long black form, which he could now distinguish to be a human body. A scum of cotton was swimming against the moon. He could see the white of a hand and the shape of an arm lying stretched in the weeds. But the body lay still with no sign of motion. "Mr. Reardon?" It was a whisper struggling to be a cry. It was the terrible sound of eagerness fighting against a voice that could be nothing but a moan of pain. He did not know which came first. It felt like a single shock. His thought that the voice was familiar, a ray of moonlight breaking through the cotton, the movement of falling down on his knees by the white oval of a face, and the recognition. It was the wet nurse. He felt the boy's hand clutching his with the abnormal strength of agony, while he was noticing the tortured lines of the face, the drained lips, the glazing eyes, and the thin dark trickle from a small black hole in too wrong, too close a spot on the left side of the boy's chest. "Mr. Reardon, I wanted to stop them. I wanted to save you." "What happened to you, kid?" "They shot me, so I wouldn't talk. I wanted to prevent—" His hand fumbled toward the red glare in the sky. "What they're doing. I was too late, but I've tried to. I've tried, and I'm still able to talk. Listen, they—" "You need help. Let's get you to a hospital and—" "No, wait. I don't think I have much time left to me, and I've got to tell you. Listen, that riot, it's staged, on orders from Washington. It's not workers, not your workers.